6 months ago, I walked into a dining room filled with excitement and pride because my daughter had come home. But before that night was over, in a single moment, I realized that the child I had raised and protected for 36 years, Sienna, was sitting across from me with the intention of harming me for money. Welcome back to Dad's Real-Life Revenge. I'm Sterling Vance. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable. And remember this, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. $68 million. That was the exact amount sitting in my trust account. It was the price of 42 years spent fighting my way through the business world. And what did I get in return? A calculating look from my own daughter. Cordelia, my devoted wife, had been gone for less than 100 days. Her ashes rested in Lake Norman Cemetery, and the ground above them had barely settled. Yet our only daughter had already scripted a fateful dinner. Sienna walked into the house wearing an elegant black dress. She smiled. The smile was exactly like Cordelia's, but her eyes were completely empty. When had greed begun to hollow out her soul? The contrast tightened my chest. I had spent my entire life shielding her from every storm. I gave her black cards with no spending limit. I bought her the finest luxury apartment downtown when she wanted to move out on her own. I had believed that the bond between father and daughter was something beyond value. But to Sienna, this father's life was worth nothing more than the lifeless numbers written on the pages of a will. The familiar dining room suddenly felt suffocating. The faint scent of candles could not hide the smell of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The clinking of silverware against porcelain echoed with a dry, hollow sound. I watched my beloved daughter place food onto my plate. Her hand trembled slightly. An unusual touch of her handbag. The instincts of a businessman who had survived hundreds of major deals told me that something was wrong. My intuition had never failed me. The outrage rose into my throat as I realized the bitter truth. The child who once cried hysterically when she saw me cut my hand was now calmly staring at her father's glass of wine with a dark scheme in mind. I took a deep breath. This fight for survival had only just begun. I stared at the glass of deep red wine on the table. The light from the chandelier reflected off its still surface. It shimmered with an eerie glow. My mind drifted back 42 years. Back then, my entire fortune consisted of an old pickup truck and a head full of ambition. I drove that truck through freezing winter nights. I slept at roadside rest stops along the highway. This body had been pushed beyond its limits more times than I could count, just to lay the first brick of what would become today's logistics empire. Through all those stormy years, Cordelia was always by my side. She shared dry loaves of bread with me. She stayed awake through countless nights, helping me count every small order. We built this empire with sweat, tears, and blood. When Sienna was born, I swore that my daughter would never have to endure even a fraction of the hardship we had faced. I wanted her to live the life of a princess. But I was wrong. Unlimited indulgence had raised a monster. Ever since Cordelia died, half of my world had collapsed. The other half was the irreparable fracture between Sienna and me. I tried to make up for it. I tried to talk to her, but every time we faced each other, all I saw was a wall of ice. The wooden bridge connecting father and daughter was cracking a little more each day under the weight of greed. She did not want my love. She wanted the enormous fortune under my control. She looked at the chairman's seat of the corporation like a starving tiger stalking its prey. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. She quickly looked away and adjusted her collar. The silence surrounding the wine glass between us felt like a death sentence hanging in the air. I already knew what her next move would be. This betrayal was more than a slap in my face. It was a desecration of Cordelia's memory. I reached for the wedding ring on my finger. Fury and heartbreak merged into a single emotion. Tonight, at this very dining table, I would have to face an enemy I once called my daughter. But Sienna was not acting alone. The shadow behind her had finally stepped into the light. A familiar set of footsteps echoed from the dining room entrance. The man who walked in wore a smile that was far too perfect. A smile that sent a chill down my spine. Gideon Cross. My son-in-law walked into the room. He was wearing an expensive custom-tailored suit paid for with the very money I had earned through blood and sweat. His appearance was always so polished that it felt artificial. His hair was perfectly groomed. The smile on his lips was flawless. So flawless that it made people uneasy. He walked over to Sienna and placed a hand on her shoulder. A gesture of complicity. He bowed his head toward me with his usual respectful tone, but his eyes were filled with hunger. I knew exactly what lay beneath that polished exterior. Gideon was nothing more than a complete failure hiding behind the image of a businessman. 3 years earlier, he had burned through $2 million in a fraudulent real estate project. I had been forced to clean up the disaster to save my daughter from embarrassment. A year later, he managed to make another $5 million disappear in the cryptocurrency market. He was addicted to alcohol and drowning in enormous debts. Every time he failed, I was the one signing checks worth millions of dollars to rescue his hollow reputation. He saw me as a bottomless cash machine. But today my alcoholic son-in-law was behaving unusually well. He declined the glass of premium wine I offered him. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water. He said he was cleansing his body in preparation for a new project. My suspicions immediately rose to their highest level. A starving wolf does not suddenly refuse a good meal. It only means that it has set its sights on prey far larger. My life, the atmosphere around the dinner table grew thick and heavy. Gideon's arrival made the purpose of this dinner clearer than ever. He kept glancing at the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. He was counting the minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Bitterness rose in my throat. The daughter I loved most had chosen to stand beside this broken man against her own father. Gideon began pouring water into his glass. His eyes shifted toward Sienna. He gave a slight nod. A silent signal had been sent. I clenched my fist beneath the oak table. They thought I was a confused old man who could be led around by the nose, but they had forgotten who I was. I watched every one of Sienna's movements with absolute focus. Her hand drifted once again toward the expensive handbag beside her. The same action, repeated over and over, almost obsessively. Sienna's nervousness had gone far beyond her ability to control it. Around the dinner table, the occasional clink of silverware sounded strangely out of rhythm. I was not watching her eyes. I was watching those trembling hands. The counting discipline I had developed as a businessman allowed me to record everything with precision. The fourth time, she lightly tapped the strap of her crocodile leather Chanel handbag. The seventh time, she pretended to bend down and adjust the position of the bag beneath her chair. Then came the 11th time, her eyes fixed on the gold-plated clasp of the handbag. 11 touches in less than 15 minutes. For a man who had conducted thousands of negotiations, that was not an unconscious habit. It was the behavior of someone hiding a crime. The atmosphere in the dining room had become thick with pretense. Every now and then Gideon would tell a dull joke about the stock market. He laughed by himself. Sienna forced a polite smile in response. Her face looked pale beneath the chandelier light. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead even though the air conditioner was set to 20 degrees Celsius. Pain tore through me. The daughter I had once carried in my arms, the child I had stayed awake all night caring for whenever she had a high fever. Now she sat barely a meter away from me, counting down the moments until her father entered eternity. The silence surrounding the glass of red wine before me felt like a deadly trap. I maintained the calm expression of the chairman of a leading logistics corporation. I smiled and nodded at Gideon's flattery. But beneath the oak table, my fingers were clenched so tightly that they had turned white. My instincts rose stronger than ever. I could smell betrayal. I could see the cracks spreading across the wooden bridge of family devotion. Frustration and fury climbed into my throat, but I forced them back down. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly how they intended to strike. Suddenly, Sienna stood up. She said she needed to use the restroom to touch up her makeup. She carried the handbag with her, holding it possessively. Gideon remained at the table. He looked at me with a mysterious expression. Then he nudged my wine glass about 2 centimeters across the table. At that exact moment, the kitchen door opened slightly. A young waiter stepped out carrying a tray of fresh dishes. His eyes were not on the food. They were fixed directly on me. Filled with absolute panic, he was trying to send me a message with nothing but his eyes. A desperate warning. An urgent plea for help. My phone vibrated inside the pocket of my suit jacket. It was a call from the corporation's chief financial officer. I excused myself to Gideon and stepped out onto the nearby balcony. On the other end of the line, he confirmed a critical piece of information. The largest merger of the year had been completed. $68 million had officially been transferred into my secure personal account. An enormous sum. The crowning achievement of my business career, yet at that moment it brought me nothing but a chilling sense of dread. I ended the call and returned to the dining room. Sienna had not yet come back from the restroom. Gideon had temporarily left the table to take another phone call near the main foyer. At that moment, only Silas remained in the dining room with me, the young waiter who had just delivered the food tray. He approached to clear away the used plates. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. The porcelain dishes clattered softly against one another. Silas lowered his head. Pretending to wipe down the table, he leaned close to my ear. His voice was barely above a whisper, only loud enough for the two of us to hear. "Sir, while you were on the phone, your daughter put something into your wine." I froze. Shh. My heart pounded violently. The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. Silas's words struck me like a fatal knife driven straight into my chest. Pain tore through my soul. The brutal truth had been exposed in its rawest form. My own daughter truly wanted me dead. Silas looked up at me with frightened but determined eyes. He continued speaking quickly. He told me that his uncle had once worked for a wealthy family. His uncle had witnessed a similar poisoning scheme, but he had remained silent and spent the rest of his life haunted by regret. Silas did not want to watch that tragedy happen again. He swore that what he had seen through the crack of the kitchen door was completely real. I stared at the glass of dark red wine. It sat silently on the table like an invisible death sentence. The chandelier's light reflected through the liquid, giving it an unusual violet tint. The greed of Sienna and Gideon had transformed a celebratory drink into a poisoned cup meant to end a blood bond between father and daughter. 42 years in the business world had never prepared me for a nightmare like this. I took a deep breath to keep myself from falling apart. A surge of outrage and fury rose inside the 68-year-old man I had become. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sienna was returning. At the same time, Gideon ended his call and walked back into the room, a trace of triumph hidden behind his smile. They looked at me. They looked at the poisoned wine. The deception had reached its peak. I had to make a decision immediately. Confront them and expose everything, or remain silent and set a trap of my own. Time was now measured in seconds. I picked up the wine glass. My hand did not tremble. I looked directly into my daughter's tense eyes. And in that instant, a bold plan for a switch flashed through my mind. Sienna sat back down in her chair. She stared at my wine glass. Gideon had also returned to his seat. The familiar, flawless smile spread across his face. A brutal internal battle raged inside my mind. I wanted to jump to my feet. I wanted to throw that poisoned glass of wine directly into their faces. I wanted to scream and ask why the daughter I had raised for 36 years could be so cold-blooded. But the composure of a seasoned businessman stopped me. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would destroy the evidence. I needed a perfect revenge. I needed them to bring down this performance with their own hands. I set the wine glass back on the table. Then I glanced towards Silas, who stood tensely in the corner of the room. I gave him a quick wink. Silas was surprisingly intelligent. He understood immediately. Carrying a tray of hot soup, he approached the dining table. Then he deliberately caught his foot on the edge of the oak table. A loud crash echoed through the room. The metal tray and 2 bowls of soup spilled onto the floor beside Gideon's chair. Hot soup splashed across Gideon's trousers. He jumped to his feet and began shouting curses. Sienna immediately turned toward him in alarm and helped him up while trying to clean the stain. For 5 seconds, both of them were completely distracted. 5 seconds that would define the course of my life. My 68-year-old hands moved with the speed of a master magician. Smooth, silent, invisible. I switched my wine glass with Sienna's. The 2 glasses were identical, but now the deadly liquid sat in front of my ungrateful daughter. The safe glass was in my possession. I withdrew my hand and adjusted the collar of my suit. Everything happened in an instant. Without the slightest sound, the illusion surrounding the wine glasses remained perfectly intact. After cleaning himself up, Gideon sat down again with an irritated expression. He shot Silas a razor-sharp glare. Silas lowered his head and mumbled an apology before quickly cleaning up the mess and retreating to the kitchen. The dining room returned to its earlier silence. But the balance of power had completely changed. The counter-trap had been set. Sienna let out a quiet breath of relief. She turned toward me. Her face struggled to regain its artificial cheerfulness. Then she picked up her wine glass. The poisoned wine now rested in her trembling hand. She raised the glass toward me. Gideon immediately lifted his own glass of water. I smiled, a cold smile filled with absolute contempt. Neither of them had any idea that disaster was now calling my daughter's name. Sienna began to speak. Her voice echoed through the suffocating room. The most horrifying chapter of this dinner had officially begun. Sienna raised her wine glass toward me. She smiled, a smile of deception brought to its absolute peak. She congratulated her father on the successful completion of the $68 million deal. She said she wanted to toast to a new beginning for our family after the loss of her mother, Cordelia. The words coming from my own daughter's mouth sounded sweet, yet they were as sharp and cold as blades stabbing into my heart. Sitting beside her, Gideon also raised his glass of water. His eyes sparkled with triumph. He believed the plan was perfect. He believed he was about to become the owner of an enormous fortune. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. I raised my own safe glass of wine. I nodded slightly. I thanked them for this special dinner. I told them I would never forget this night. Sienna suspected nothing. She lifted the glass to her lips. She took a large sip. Then she drained it completely. The deadly liquid slid smoothly down her throat. I also took a sip from my own wine. Then I calmly set the glass down on the oak table. If you've followed the story this far, I'm sure it has stirred some emotions in you. Please help us with one small favor that only takes a moment. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Everything happened so quickly. Gideon stared at me. The perfect smile on his lips suddenly froze. He waited. He waited for me to collapse. He waited for me to clutch my chest in agony. But 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. I was still sitting there. I was still looking at him with a terrifying silence. The change in Gideon's expression was incredibly satisfying. His eyes widened in horror. He looked at my empty wine glass. Then he looked at Sienna's glass. Utter confusion was written across the face of the scheming man. At that exact moment, Sienna dropped her glass. The glass shattered across the floor. The sharp crash shattered the suffocating atmosphere. Sienna brought both hands to her throat. Her face twisted in pain. She could not breathe. Her eyes looked at me in complete panic. Her body began to convulse violently. She collapsed onto the dining table, sending dishes and plates crashing to the floor. The poison spread far too quickly. It was far more powerful than I could ever have imagined. Gideon rushed toward Sienna and grabbed her. For the first time, he appeared genuinely panicked, but he was not worried about his wife's life. He was terrified because the plan had gone completely wrong. He looked at me with the eyes of an animal trapped with nowhere left to run. Gideon's screams echoed throughout the suffocating dining room. The fateful dinner had turned into a scene filled with blood and tears. Retribution had arrived far sooner than expected, but the true cruelty hidden behind my son-in-law's mask would not be fully revealed until the minutes that followed. Gideon frantically shook Sienna's shoulders. She had completely lost consciousness. Foam gathered around her mouth. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sight should have shattered the heart of any father, but my heart felt as cold as ashes. I stood silently at the head of the dining table. I looked at my son-in-law with the eyes of a judge observing a condemned man. Gideon's panic reached its peak. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were trembling so badly that he entered the wrong passcode 3 times. But he did not dial emergency services. He called an unknown number instead. In a furious whisper, he said that the plan had failed and that the poison had gone to the wrong person. The moment he noticed me approaching, he ended the call. The most infuriating moment came when I reached for my phone to call an ambulance. Gideon lunged forward. He slapped the phone from my hand. It crashed onto the floor, the screen shattering instantly. He stepped in front of me, his face twisted into the savage expression of a monster. He shouted that no one was allowed to call anybody. He was afraid the police would arrive. He was afraid doctors would discover the specialized poison he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars obtaining through the underworld. He was willing to let Sienna slowly die on the dining table if it meant saving his own worthless skin. Disgust rose into my throat. This man possessed not a shred of humanity. He was willing to step over his own wife's body to protect himself. But he had made one fatal mistake. Silas had been standing at the dining room entrance for some time, holding a phone that was actively recording. And from outside, the distant sound of ambulance, sirens, and police vehicles was already growing louder. I had called them before I ever sat down at this dinner table. 10 minutes later, the emergency team rushed into the room. They placed Sienna onto a stretcher and immediately began resuscitation efforts. The lead physician looked at the spilled wine on the table. He collected a sample of the liquid and examined it. His expression changed instantly. He looked directly at Gideon before turning to the police officers who had just entered the room. The doctor stated with certainty that the quantity of poison involved was far too large to be accidental. This was an intentional attempted murder. Gideon stepped backward. His back struck the cold wall. He looked around the room and finally realized that the trap had completely closed around him. But evil people always have one last desperate move. As the officers approached, Gideon suddenly pointed straight at me. He shouted at the top of his lungs, accusing me of something horrifying, a false accusation that had the potential to turn the entire investigation upside down. Gideon pointed directly at me. He shouted at the police that I was the one who had poisoned my own daughter. He accused me of wanting to keep the entire $68 million for myself, and claimed that I had committed a cruel and ruthless act. Tears appeared on command. He played the role of a grieving husband who was about to lose his wife. The officers immediately turned their attention toward me with suspicion in their eyes. My silence only made them more cautious. But I was not worried. A seasoned businessman never enters a battle without preparing his weapons first. I gave a slight nod toward Silas. The young waiter stepped forward and handed his phone, still playing the recording, to the lead detective. Gideon's shouting in the dining room echoed clearly through the audio. The recording proved that he had tried to prevent anyone from calling for emergency help. It proved that he knew about the poison. The color instantly drained from Gideon's face. At that exact moment, a team of private investigators I had hired earlier entered the room. They carried a thick stack of documents. Justice was finally beginning to unfold in a deeply satisfying way. They presented evidence that Gideon could not deny. For months, he had secretly monitored my financial accounts. Most damning of all was a forged draft of my will bearing a counterfeit version of my signature. According to that document, if I died, my entire estate would transfer directly to Sienna. Immediately afterward, Gideon would gain full control over everything. An even more horrifying truth emerged when investigators examined Gideon's finances. He was carrying gambling debts totaling $400,000 with underground casinos. Every one of those debts had been signed in Sienna's name without her knowledge. He had pushed my daughter into a corner. He had turned her into an accomplice in a plan to kill her father in exchange for money to erase his debts. Pain and disgust rose to unbearable levels inside me. The daughter I had raised for 36 years had been manipulated by this broken man until she had lost all sense of humanity. The police immediately escorted Gideon to the hospital where Sienna was receiving emergency treatment so they could continue questioning him. There, in the hospital corridor, the psychological pressure finally shattered him. When a doctor informed him that Sienna might spend the rest of her life in a vegetative state, Gideon made a fatal mistake. In front of detectives, he shouted a single sentence. She wasn't supposed to drink that wine. That statement was the clearest confession possible. He had admitted that the wine had originally been intended for me. The most satisfying moment had finally arrived. The lead detective needed no further evidence. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. A sharp metallic click echoed through the hallway. Gideon's wrists were locked together on the spot. He collapsed to his knees on the cold hospital floor. The punishment he deserved was now waiting for him. But this story could not end there. As the first light of dawn slowly appeared on the horizon, I still had one final truth to face. Would my daughter wake up and live long enough to hear the final judgment from her father? Gideon Cross was sentenced to 27 years in prison without parole. It was a fitting price for his greed and cold-blooded cruelty. Sienna was fortunate to survive thanks to the doctor's timely intervention. But her brain suffered severe damage. She would spend the rest of her life confined to a wheelchair. Pain tears through my heart every time I look at my only daughter, who was once born with every advantage, now living with a permanent disability. But justice is justice. Betrayal always comes with a very high price. I did not abandon her. I established a conditional trust fund through a bank. The money is sufficient only to cover her medical expenses and professional care for the rest of her life. She will never again have access to a single dollar of that $68 million fortune. As for Silas, the kind-hearted waiter, I paid for his entire college education so he could fulfill his dream of earning a degree. He deserved a bright future after the quiet act of courage he showed that night. I stood alone on the balcony of my home overlooking Lake Norman. The first light of dawn was slowly breaking across the horizon. The lake's surface was calm and crystal clear, like a mirror reflecting my life back at me. 42 years of struggle in the business world had brought me success and wealth. Yet in the end, what remained was a cold dining room and a shattered family. Money does not destroy families. It merely reveals the truth that was already hidden inside them. Human greed is a bottomless abyss. If we fail to control it, it will consume everything we hold sacred. Sienna's betrayal left a deep scar on my heart, but I chose to face it and move forward. Overcoming betrayal is not about revenge. It is about refusing to let darkness become the final chapter of your life. This story is a reminder of the power of kindness between strangers. If you found value in it, please share it and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next awakening truth. Thank you for listening to my story. Cherish the people beside you before greed blinds them. Goodbye, and I will see you again. My daughter said, "Dad, we canceled the flight. You don't need to go to Florida anymore." Melissa said it while still tapping on her phone. She never even looked at me. Her voice was flat, like she was casually mentioning tomorrow's weather forecast. I froze in the middle of the living room. My fingers tightened around the freshly printed boarding pass. Tampa. The trip I had planned for 2 whole months to visit Samuel, my old war buddy. My suitcase was packed. I had even put on my cleanest pressed shirt. But my daughter erased the entire trip with one tap on her screen. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Grab a drink, some snacks, sit back and remember this: the people in these stories always had every chance to do the right thing. They simply chose wrong. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment number 1 so we can begin today's story. At that moment, my chest tightened. I looked at Melissa. She kept scrolling like nothing happened. My son-in-law Ryan walked out of the kitchen carrying my coffee mug. He took a sip from it and nodded in agreement with his wife. Ryan said a storm was coming to Tampa. They only did this because they cared about my health. They said they wanted to protect me. Protect. That was always their favorite word. They used it to justify every controlling decision. They gave themselves permission to manage my entire life. I was 70 years old. I built this house with my own hands. I used to lead a crew of over a dozen carpenters. Now I felt like a child inside my own home. I was no longer allowed to decide where I could go. The boarding pass in my hand suddenly became worthless. Just another useless piece of paper. Anger crawled slowly up my spine. But I did not yell. I did not argue. 15 years in carpentry taught me restraint. When a plank bends out of shape, you do not smash it apart with a hammer. You find a way to bend it back. I looked straight into Melissa's eyes. She finally glanced up, slightly startled by my silence. Slowly, I slipped the ticket into my shirt pocket. Then I turned around and walked away. I did not say another word, but inside my head, a clock had already started counting down. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally gained control over this old man. They were wrong. This was not surrender. This was the beginning of my revenge. I walked toward my old bedroom. Every step across the wooden floor sent dry creaks echoing through the house. I built this place with my own hands. Every beam, every brick, every nail carried my sweat. Yet now, somehow, I felt like a guest renting space inside my own home. The past 26 months had been a slow invasion. Quiet, careful, like a parasite feeding on my freedom from the inside out. At first, it started with Melissa's sweet suggestions about moving in together so they could take care of me. I let my guard down. I thought it was love, family loyalty, a daughter wanting to protect her father. I was wrong. The changes came little by little, like water carving through stone. First, it was the mailbox. Ryan replaced the lock without asking and kept the only key. He said it would make paying the bills easier if he handled everything himself. Then Melissa moved my blood pressure medication into her kitchen cabinet. Every morning she counted the pills into my hand one by one like she was rationing supplies to a prisoner. Even my grocery list became something they controlled. One afternoon I wrote down steak. Melissa crossed it out with a pen. She said old people should not eat too much protein. That control happened every single day. Small, constant, smothering, always disguised as love. Little by little, I began feeling less like a man and more like a fossil sitting inside a museum display built from my own life. But the thing that truly tightened around my heart was what happened to Margaret. My wife had been gone for 3 years. The only thing left of her in the living room was an old striped velvet armchair. She spent 30 years sitting there reading books beneath the evening lamp. Whenever I looked at that chair, I could still see her. One afternoon, I came home from a walk and the chair was gone. I found it abandoned in the dark corner of the basement storage room. When I asked about it, Ryan answered without a hint of guilt. He said the chair looked outdated. He said it got in the children's way. His voice was casual, but those words crushed every memory I had left. They were not just trying to control my present anymore. They were trying to erase my past. I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the empty room. Frustration twisted inside my throat until I could barely breathe. I had tolerated too much for too long. I had mistaken politeness for peace. My daughter and her husband believed this old man no longer had any teeth left. They thought I would stay quiet and grow old exactly the way they wanted. But they forgot something important. I was a carpenter, and a good carpenter always knows to wait for the wood grain to settle before making the first cut. Melissa thought she was helping me. But the next night, as I passed their bedroom door, I accidentally overheard them discussing plans to sell the house I had lived in my entire life, as if I were already gone. That sentence shattered the last piece of patience I had left inside me. And that was the moment the plan began. The first move of my revenge would start in a place they would never expect. That night I could not sleep. The conversation about selling my house kept replaying inside my head over and over again. Every word sounded like a hammer driving nails straight into my skull. I sat alone in the darkness of my bedroom. The silence around me felt almost unnatural. Moonlight spilled weakly across the stained walls through the window. My mind drifted backward into the past, back to the years when Margaret was still beside me. I remembered the way she sat in that armchair every evening with a book resting in her lap. I remembered her voice, soft, calm, yet always firm when it needed to be. And then inside that crushing silence, I almost heard her whisper. It felt as if Margaret's voice had reached across the void itself. One sentence she told me years ago suddenly echoed through my mind with painful clarity. "Thomas, since when did you become a houseplant?" The question hit me like a slap across the face. It woke me up from a long sleep I never realized I was trapped inside. A houseplant. She was right. For 26 months I had lived exactly like one. People watered me, so I stayed alive. People trimmed my branches, and I accepted it. People shoved me into dark corners, and I stayed quiet. I had been too polite, too weak beneath the fake kindness and false devotion my daughter wrapped around me like chains. That realization lit a fire inside my chest. I was not a decoration sitting silently in someone else's living room. I was a man. Blood still ran through my veins. These hands once built an entire life from nothing but wood, sweat, and determination. This house existed because of me. And suddenly I understood my greatest mistake. I had traded my freedom for fake peace. My silence had not created respect. It had only fed their arrogance, their greed. Piece by piece, my identity had been buried beneath Ryan's lectures and Melissa's constant control. But not anymore. I would not allow them to write the final chapter of my life for me. I stood up and walked toward the closet. My hands searched through the darkness until my fingers brushed against familiar fabric. The blue shirt. Margaret's favorite. The shirt I wore on the most important days of my life. Slowly I pulled it out and hung it carefully by the door. Tomorrow I would wear it again, because a plan had already formed inside my mind, and the first step would strike directly at Melissa and Ryan's smug certainty. I knew exactly where I needed to go at sunrise. That place held the key to my freedom, and it was also where my daughter's true face would finally be exposed. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of Margaret's blue shirt. That shade of blue always gave me a strange feeling of peace mixed with strength, like wearing armor stitched together from old memories. I left the house quietly while the children were still asleep. My destination was Independence Bank, the place where I had trusted the savings of my entire lifetime. The cold air from the lobby vents hit my face as I stepped through the tall glass doors. I walked directly to the service counter and asked to review every account under my name. The young teller looked at me with a strange expression, almost pity. Then she quietly escorted me into the branch manager's private office. The moment I sat down in that leather chair, I felt it. Something was wrong. The manager slid a thick stack of documents across the desk toward me. I turned the pages slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. Rage rose inside my chest until it clogged my throat. For 18 months, Melissa had secretly installed online access permissions to every single one of my bank accounts. She had changed all paper statements into electronic delivery. That explained why my mailbox outside had stayed empty for so long. She had been controlling my money completely. Every dollar I spent, every transaction I made, every withdrawal. She could see all of it. Worse than that, she had even placed cash withdrawal restrictions on my accounts without my direct approval. This was no longer concern. This was betrayal. My own daughter, the little girl I once carried on my shoulders. The child I protected my entire life. Now she viewed me as some helpless old man who needed supervision. They were trying to turn me into someone completely dependent on them. I took a deep breath to stop my hands from shaking. Then I looked directly at the branch manager, with the cold determination of a man who had survived storms for more than half a century. I demanded that every unknown device immediately lose access to my accounts. I reset every PIN number connected to my cards. I redirected all account alerts and balance notifications to a private phone number, a number I had secretly purchased the week before. One door closed, and financial control returned to my hands. When the final paperwork was complete, I signed my name with firm, steady strokes across the bottom of the documents. Then I walked out of the bank beneath the bright morning sun. For the first time in months, my chest felt lighter. It was only a small step, but it was the first real victory. Still, I understood something clearly. Money was only part of the problem. My house, my freedom, my future. Those were the things truly at stake. When I returned home, Melissa and Ryan were sitting at the kitchen table pretending nothing had happened. Calm, comfortable, completely unaware that the control they held over me had just been severed. But I did not go upstairs to my bedroom. Instead, I walked straight toward the basement door. For 2 years, Melissa had forbidden me from going down there. She always claimed it was too dangerous for an old man. I wrapped my hand around the dusty wooden handle and slowly pushed the door open. Because hidden behind that door was something waiting for me. Something that would help me reclaim the man I used to be and prepare the next strike they would never see coming. I walked down the steep wooden stairs leading into the basement. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of ancient dust. Melissa always claimed this place was dangerous. She said the stairs were too steep and the floor too slippery for an old man, but I knew the real reason. They did not want me touching my past. They did not want me remembering who I used to be. I flipped the light switch. Weak yellow light spread across the basement, pushing back the darkness just enough for me to see. I walked straight toward the corner where Ryan had dumped Margaret's armchair. The old striped velvet chair still sat there beside stacks of forgotten cardboard boxes, abandoned, just like the memories attached to it. I moved past the clutter until I reached my workbench. 2 years. It had been 2 years since I stood in this exact spot. I brushed my palm across the thick layer of dust covering the walnut surface. Slowly, the rich wood grain emerged beneath my hand, sharp lines twisting through dark brown patterns like veins beneath skin. Walnut was strong wood, stubborn wood. It demanded precision, patience, confidence. A weak hand could ruin it forever. As my fingers traced, the grain warmth traveled from my palm straight into my chest. The smell of wood oil, dry lumber, and years of hard labor filled my lungs. And suddenly it felt like I remembered my own name again. I was not some confused old man waiting to be managed. I was Thomas Bennett, master carpenter. I reached for the handsaw hanging on the wall. The steel blade still gleamed beneath its thin coat of oil from the day I closed this workshop for the last time. I grabbed a spare piece of wood and made the first cut. Shk, 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 shk. The steady rhythm echoed through the basement, and with every pull of the saw, my thoughts became clearer. Carpentry had taught me how to transform rough, broken timber into something beautiful. Now I would use that same patience and discipline to rebuild my own life. I would fix the mistakes I had tolerated for too long. Melissa wanted to sell this house. They wanted to shove me into a nursing home so they could spend my money freely without inconvenience. That would never happen. I placed the saw back on the table and stared into the dim basement light. The preparation stage of my plan was complete. I already knew the next step. Money in the bank was protected now. But this house needed something stronger. Permanent legal protection. I pulled out my phone and searched through an old contact list I had not touched in years. Leonard Harris, a seasoned attorney, and an old family friend. This phone call would change the entire balance of power. I needed to meet him tomorrow morning in a quiet private office. Because I was about to make a decision so unexpected that Melissa and Ryan would never see it coming. Not even in their worst nightmares. The next morning I left the house early and drove downtown to a blue glass office tower rising above the city streets. Leonard Harris's law office was on the 12th floor. The moment I stepped through the heavy oak doors, the familiar smell of paper and printer ink hit me. Leonard greeted me with the tight embrace only old friends understand. Then we sat across from each other in silence for a moment. I did not waste time. I told him immediately that I wanted to change everything regarding my trust fund and inheritance arrangements. Leonard's expression turned serious as he opened the old legal files. According to my previous will, Melissa would inherit everything after my death. The house, the accounts, every piece of property I spent my entire life building. I took a slow breath and stared out the giant office windows overlooking the busy streets below. Then I spoke calmly, but with absolute certainty. I want Melissa completely removed from the inheritance. Leonard looked up sharply. I want this house transferred to my grandson Noah when he turns 21. The decision did not come from hatred. It came from justice. Melissa had chosen to treat me like a problem to manage instead of a father to respect. She no longer deserved the reward of my lifetime of work. Leonard nodded slowly and began typing across his keyboard. He explained that we needed stronger protections than a simple will. He recommended establishing complete living control over all assets while I was still alive. That meant nobody could interfere with my finances, property, or personal decisions under the excuse of guardianship or elderly care. I agreed immediately. This was the legal shield I needed to destroy their plan completely. If you've made it this far, this is the moment justice finally begins. Take one quick second to subscribe. Most people watch without doing it, but it helps us more than you know. And tell me in the comments, do you believe elderly parents deserve the right to control their own lives? When the final pages of the new will slid out of the printer, I picked up the fountain pen resting beside me. 2 legal witnesses stood nearby as I signed my name. Each stroke of ink felt like hammering nails into solid wood. Permanent, final, unshakable. Relief spread slowly through my body. The power was back where it belonged. With me. Melissa and Ryan thought I was nothing more than an old pawn they could move around whenever they pleased. What they did not realize was that they had already been removed from the financial future they believed belonged to them. I placed the stamped copy of the new will inside my leather briefcase, shook Leonard's hand goodbye, and stepped into the elevator. But I knew the hardest part was still ahead. I still had to go back to that house, back to the 2 people pretending they owned my life. And the moment I pushed open the front door, I knew something had changed. Ryan was already waiting in the living room. His face looked dark and furious. In his hands was a stack of banking reports from the linked account notifications. The mask of the so-called caretaker was finally beginning to crack, and the confrontation waiting for me was now unavoidable. Ryan stood in the middle of the living room with his face burning red. One hand held a thick stack of bank reports raised in the air like evidence in a courtroom. Melissa sat stiffly on the sofa beside him, her eyes blazing with anger. The entire room felt like a chamber filled with gunpowder, waiting for a spark. The second I locked the front door behind me, Ryan stormed forward. He demanded to know why I had cut off access to the accounts. He shouted that my actions were irrational, selfish, and ungrateful. According to him, they had wasted the entire morning trying to fix the chaos I caused at the bank. I did not back away. I calmly placed my leather briefcase containing the new will on the table beside me. Then I straightened my back and looked directly into my arrogant son-in-law's eyes. My voice dropped low, cold, sharp. "What gives you the right to manage my money?" Ryan froze for half a second. Then the arrogance returned. He immediately launched into another lecture. He said I was old. He claimed my mind was no longer clear enough to manage finances responsibly. He insisted Melissa only controlled the accounts to protect the house and secure my future. Then he accused me of unfairly punishing my own daughter. Anger crawled slowly up my spine. but I never raised my voice. Instead, I took one slow step closer and looked toward Melissa. My daughter remained silent beside him, quietly agreeing with every word coming out of his mouth. They had grown too comfortable with my patience. They believed fear and guilt would keep me obedient forever. But they were wrong. I stepped directly in front of Ryan until only an arm's length separated us. Then I spoke, and the sentence that left my mouth froze the entire room. Canceling another grown man's plans is not care. It is control. The words landed like an axe, splitting rotten wood in half. Ryan's mouth fell open. Melissa instantly stood up, ready to interrupt me. I raised one hand, and she stopped talking immediately. For the first time in years, the authority of the true owner of this house filled the room again. I looked at both of them carefully. "Listen to me clearly," I said. "The money is mine, this house is mine, and nobody decides how I live except me." Ryan let out a mocking laugh. He said I could keep my money if I wanted, but I still could not go anywhere without their help. Then he smugly reminded me that my Tampa flight had already been canceled. He thought isolation still gave him power over me. He thought I was trapped inside this house. I looked at the smug expression stretched across his face. Then I smiled. Slowly I reached into the pocket of my blue shirt and pulled something out. A small object. I placed it carefully on the table, directly in front of them. The moment they saw it, both of their faces changed instantly. Because sitting on the table was the one thing they never expected me to have. A brand new set of car keys. And in that moment, the real counterattack finally began. The object I placed on the table was not a set of car keys. It was a brand new plane ticket. I had rebooked my flight to Tampa myself at sunrise, and this time they had no way to interfere. Every access point had already been locked down the day before. Melissa stared at the ticket in complete disbelief. Ryan stood frozen beside her. For the first time, both of them understood something terrifying. The absolute control they once held over me was gone. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the front door. Neither of them dared to stop me. A few hours later, I arrived in Florida. The bright Tampa sunlight wrapped around me the moment I stepped out of the airport. Warm ocean wind rushed across my face, carrying away the suffocating pressure that had buried me for the past 26 months. Samuel was waiting near the exit. Still, the same as always. The same booming laugh. The same powerful slap on the shoulder from the soldier I once fought beside decades ago. We drove back to his small beachside house near the water. And for 3 days I rediscovered the taste of freedom. I woke up whenever I wanted. I ate whatever food I craved without someone inspecting my plate like a prison guard. Samuel and I sat on the porch drinking beer while reliving old war stories. We laughed until our stomachs hurt. No one watched me. No one monitored me. No one questioned whether my mind was still functioning properly. The contrast hit me harder with every passing hour. Only then did I fully realize how miserable my life back home had become. On the final night in Tampa, I stood alone on the balcony while waves rolled gently against the shore below. The ocean wind swept through my silver hair as I stared up at the stars, and I thought about Margaret. Quietly, I spoke to my late wife beneath the endless night sky. I should have done this sooner. My voice almost disappeared into the wind. I stayed weak for too long. I let them cage me inside my own life. But things were different now. The strength had returned. The determination of the carpenter inside me had finally awakened again. This trip was never just a vacation. It was a reset. A necessary silence before the final move. Because freedom had ignited something powerful inside me. I could no longer share a home with people who fed off my life while pretending it was love. It was time to clean out the house I built with my own hands. The next morning I packed my bags and prepared to fly home. My mind felt calm, cold, focused. I knew Melissa and Ryan would be waiting for me. Maybe angry, maybe ready for another confrontation. But they had no idea what I was bringing back with me. An ultimatum that would shatter their world completely. The ending waiting for them inside that living room would be the most terrifying moment of their lives. And this time I would not give them a single chance to beg. I stepped through the front door just as darkness settled outside. Melissa and Ryan were already sitting at the dining table in the living room. Their faces were cold and expressionless. Silence hung over the house like a storm seconds away from breaking. The moment I set my suitcase down, Ryan shot to his feet. A smug grin spread across his face. He said my little vacation was over, and it was time for me to return to reality. Then he started talking about an appointment he had arranged for the following week with an assisted living facility. According to him, it was the best place for me now. Melissa slid a prepared document across the table toward me. All I needed to do, she said, was sign the papers agreeing to sell the house. Strangely enough, I felt completely calm. The anger from previous days had disappeared. In its place was the cold certainty of a carpenter preparing to cut away rotten wood. I never even looked at the papers. Instead, I slowly opened my leather briefcase and removed the thick legal file stamped with the red seal of Leonard Harris's law office. Then I placed it directly on the table and pushed it toward Melissa. My voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of iron. Read page 3 carefully. Melissa frowned as she opened the file. Ryan leaned closer beside her, and the second their eyes landed on the legal language, the entire room froze. Melissa's face drained of color. Her hands started trembling. The documents clearly stated that ownership of the house and inheritance rights had been transferred to my grandson Noah. Melissa had been completely removed. And beneath that was the clause establishing my absolute authority over all financial and property decisions while still alive. No outside interference. No guardianship manipulation. No control. Melissa suddenly burst into tears. She screamed, asking how I could take away what belonged to her. She kept repeating that she was my only daughter. Then she accused me of being manipulated by outsiders. Ryan lunged forward as if he wanted to snatch the documents away, but my hand slammed down firmly on top of them first. I looked directly into the eyes of the two people unraveling in front of me. Then I delivered the ultimatum. You have 90 days to pack your belongings and leave this house. Melissa broke down completely. She begged me not to throw my own daughter out into the street. She pleaded for compassion, for family, for forgiveness. Slowly, I stood up, and I looked at the daughter I once loved with every piece of my heart. Then I spoke with absolute certainty. Love and boundaries can exist in the same room, I said quietly. But respect is not negotiable. The room fell silent again. You chose control over love, I continued. Now you will live with the consequences. Ryan exploded with rage. He slammed both hands against the table and shouted that I would regret everything. He swore I would die alone inside this empty house with nobody left to care for me. But the threats no longer touched me. That same night they began throwing their belongings into suitcases. The sound of rolling luggage echoed violently through the hallway. Hours later I stood beside the living room window and watched their car disappear into the darkness. And for the first time in years, the house finally belonged to me again. The silence afterward felt almost unreal, peaceful, sacred. But just as the last sound of the car vanished into the night, I heard something else. A strange noise, coming from the basement storage room. Like something hidden beneath the floor was trying to speak to me. Or perhaps, like one final message Margaret had left behind waiting for me to find it. I hurried down the steep basement stairs toward the sound beneath the house. The steady tapping echoed from the dark corner behind my workbench. I shoved several cardboard boxes aside, and suddenly my heart tightened. Noah, my 10-year-old grandson, was crouched on the basement floor, holding a leftover piece of walnut wood in one hand and a small metal tool in the other. He was tapping against the grain, imitating the sound of my hammer. The moment he looked up at me, his eyes were clear and fearless. "I don't want to go with them," he whispered. My chest froze. "I want to stay here with you, Grandpa." He lowered his eyes toward the workbench. "I want you to teach me carpentry." Slowly I knelt beside him and placed my hands on his small shoulders. And for the first time in many years, the tears I had buried inside myself finally escaped. Not from pain, not from anger, but from relief. Real relief. This house finally had the right air. Melissa and Ryan left this home driven by greed and control. But without realizing it, they abandoned the greatest treasure of my life. Weeks passed, and the house became quiet again. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful silence of healing. Ryan's arrogant shouting disappeared from the hallways. Melissa's constant control no longer poisoned the air. Every evening I sat beside the walnut table I had finished with my own hands. I placed it next to Margaret's striped velvet armchair after bringing it back to its rightful place in the living room. Sometimes when the sunset poured through the windows just right, I almost felt Margaret smiling at us. Noah sat beside me, carefully carving small wooden toys beneath the warm light, and little by little, the man I used to be returned completely. I had rebuilt my life with my own hands. Listen to me carefully. You do not need permission. Not from your children. Not from their spouses. Not from anyone. You already earned the space you occupy in this world. Do not allow anyone to rearrange your life without your consent. If this story helped you find strength inside yourself, share it with someone else who needs to wake up before it is too late. Being 60, 70, or 80 years old does not mean your story is over. Do not let anyone else write the final chapters of your life. Take your life back. Starting today. I looked out the living room window as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. My counterattack was complete. Justice had finally been served. Or at least, that was what I believed. Because when I turned the final page of an old book resting on the walnut table, something slipped loose from the spine and fluttered onto the floor. A small yellowed piece of paper. A handwritten letter. Margaret's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. It was dated shortly before her death. But she had never given it to me. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the fragile paper and began reading the crooked lines of ink. And within seconds the world around me tilted sideways. Because the letter contained a horrifying secret about Melissa's past. A secret Margaret had hidden for 15 years to protect me. My daughter mocked me and said, "My father-in-law built everything himself while you're useless and have done nothing for this family." I steadied myself, remained calm, and replied, "Then tell your father-in-law to pay your bills because I will stop paying your bills from now on." Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, make yourself comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose wrong. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. The story began with the clinking sound of silverware against porcelain plates. The atmosphere in the room was stifling, even though the scent of expensive candles filled the air. Lillian sat across from me. Beside her were Richard and her in-laws, Harold and Victoria. Sunday dinner at this luxurious mansion always started the same way. Elegant yet cold. Harold took a sip of premium wine. He looked at me with the usual scrutinizing gaze. He began rambling about his latest real estate project. About manual laborers, whom he called people indifferent to achievement. Victoria smiled, smugly. She stroked the sparkling diamond necklace around her neck beneath the crystal chandelier. Lillian looked at me. There was no respect in my daughter's eyes, only disappointment. She began comparing me to Harold. She said Harold was an ideal role model, a self-made man with ambition, while I was merely someone content with mediocrity, a man who had never stepped outside his comfort zone his entire life. The breaking point came with little Emma's innocent question. She tilted her head and asked loudly, "Why didn't Grandpa build a big company like Grandpa Harold? Why isn't Grandpa rich?" The child's words hit me like a bucket of cold water thrown straight into my face. The entire table suddenly fell silent. Richard said nothing. He simply wore a contemptuous half-smile. Harold and Victoria exchanged triumphant glances. The arrogance of my in-laws was written across their faces. My daughter did not defend her father. Lillian silently agreed with those mocking remarks. She had forgotten who had raised her. The ingratitude of the daughter I once loved more than my own life made my chest tighten. How ridiculous. They sat, surrounded by luxury, and judged my poverty. They had no idea what the truth really was. My patience had reached its limit. I set my napkin down on the table. I looked directly into Lillian's eyes. It was time for this mask to come off. I stood up. The screech of the wooden chair against the marble floor echoed sharply through the room. Everyone at the table turned their attention to me. Harold stopped smiling. Richard lowered his wine glass. Lillian looked at me with a mixture of surprise and irritation. My calmness caught them off guard. I was not angry. I felt only a strange sense of relief. I looked directly into my daughter's eyes and spoke each word clearly. "Starting tomorrow, I will stop paying all of your bills. I will not cover a single expense anymore." Lillian stared at me blankly. Then she laughed out loud as if she had just heard a joke. What bills? What are you talking about? Dad, are you confused? We pay for everything ourselves. Richard, sitting beside her, suddenly went rigid. The color drained from his face. The contemptuous smile vanished instantly. He quickly lowered his head and avoided my gaze. Beads of sweat began forming on the forehead of my cherished son-in-law. He knew exactly what I was talking about. But Lillian had no idea. She had been living in luxury, believing her husband provided everything. I slowly pulled a neatly folded sheet of paper from my jacket pocket. I unfolded it and placed it on the table. It was a list of automatic monthly payments from my personal bank account. I began reading the figures aloud. The first payment is $3,200 for the rent on this mansion. The second is Emma's tuition at her international private school. The third is the insurance for both of your luxury vehicles. The fourth is the salary for the housekeeper and the gardener. The total comes to $7,750 per month. Every cent has been withdrawn directly from my account for the past 8 years. Lillian froze. The paper on the table was like a bomb that had just exploded. She stared at the numbers. Her face turned pale, completely drained of color. She looked at her husband. Richard was utterly silent. He did not dare say a single word. Victoria and Harold looked visibly uncomfortable as well. Their arrogance disappeared in an instant. They had never imagined that the luxurious mansion sheltering them was actually being maintained by the money of the retired old man they had just mocked. Lillian stammered as she turned to Richard. "What is this? You told me the company paid the rent. Why is it Dad's money?" Richard remained silent. I looked at my daughter one last time before turning and walking away. I did not need to hear their argument. The truth had begun to surface. But Lillian still did not know the full horrifying truth behind it all. She could never have imagined that this money was only the tip of the iceberg. Richard's deception was far worse than that, 100 times worse. I took a taxi back to my one-bedroom apartment. It was located in an aging neighborhood. The narrow hallway carried the smell of boiled cabbage and dampness. The apartment was the complete opposite of the luxury I had just left behind. It contained only a single bed, a scratched wooden table, and peeling walls. But here I found peace. I sat down in the old chair. My eyes drifted to Margaret's photograph on the table. My wife had been gone for 8 years. The longing had never faded. A flood of memories came rushing back, making my chest tighten. When Margaret fell ill, my family was plunged into hardship. After she passed away, I made a decision that changed the course of my life. I sold the dream home my wife and I had shared on Maple Street. The house with the garden full of roses that Margaret had planted with her own hands. I sold every family heirloom, every piece of jewelry. I did not even keep my wedding ring. I did not keep a single dollar for myself. I deposited all of it into an automatic payment account to support Lillian. I wanted my daughter to have the best life possible. I wanted her to never feel inferior when she stepped into Harold's household. To maintain those $7,750 in monthly payments, I had to live an ascetic life. For the past 8 years, I worked extra jobs every weekend without fail. I survived on peanut butter sandwiches. There were weeks when I skipped meals and ate only once a day to save every penny. I lost 17 kilograms. My body became thin and frail, and my hands grew rough and calloused. I accepted living like a skeleton so that my daughter could wear designer clothes and hold her head with pride. And what did I receive in return at tonight's dinner? Contempt from my in-laws, and ingratitude from the very child I had raised and loved with all my heart. It was heartbreaking. I let out a long sigh and switched off the old desk lamp. Half of the cruel truth had already been exposed. I had to let my daughter investigate and discover the deep pit of her own ignorance. She would have to face it herself. She would have to pay the price in order to build a better life. My phone screen lit up. The ringtone echoed through the silence of the small apartment. The clock showed exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. It was Lillian calling. Her voice was choked with tears and trembling on the other end of the line. She had spent the entire night crying, unable to sleep. "Dad," she said in a panic, "I checked everything again. I went through all of Richard's bank statements. I discovered that the account numbers used to pay the rent don't match any of my husband's accounts. They all lead to a hidden account. I don't understand what's happening anymore. Please, Dad, tell me the truth." The pain and shock in my daughter's voice made my heart ache, but I knew I could not keep the truth hidden any longer. The perfect facade my son-in-law had built was finally about to shatter. I took a deep breath to steady myself, and spoke in a low, sorrowful voice. Lillian, that money did not fall from the sky. Over the past 8 years, the total amount I have paid to support your luxurious lifestyle has been $744,000. Do you know where that enormous amount of money came from? I paused before continuing. It was your mother's entire insurance payout. And it was also the money I received after selling the home full of memories on Maple Street. The line went completely silent. All I could hear was Lillian's ragged breathing. This painful truth struck directly at her pride. My poor daughter was realizing that she had been living in luxury through her mother's sacrifice and her father's complete self-denial. Lillian broke down sobbing. She could not believe that her husband had been willing to let his father-in-law carry the entire burden while he presented himself as a successful provider. The betrayal was overwhelming. It was more than a wife who had always trusted her husband could bear. I told Lillian to stay calm and try to get some rest. This story isn't over yet, I said. The curtain of lies has only been lifted a little. After hanging up, I sat quietly in the darkness, my heart heavy. I knew this was only the beginning of what Richard and his family had been hiding from her. There was a timid knock at the door late that afternoon. I opened it. Lillian was standing there. My daughter looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying all night. The expensive designer coat she wore seemed strangely out of place inside this old one-bedroom apartment. Lillian stepped inside. She looked around slowly. Her eyes stopped on the rusted mini gas stove. On the table sat nothing but a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. The smell of boiled cabbage from lunch still lingered in the air. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes again. She could not believe that her father was living in a place this cramped and impoverished. For the first time she saw the selfishness of her own actions. She had enjoyed comfort at the cost of her father's suffering. I smiled gently, trying to reassure her. I pulled out an old wooden chair and invited Lillian to sit down. Then I walked over to the metal wardrobe. From the back of its deepest compartment, I retrieved a small velvet box, worn smooth with age. I opened it and removed a gold locket. It was the only keepsake I had left from Margaret, my late wife. I placed the locket into Lillian's trembling hand. Then I spoke in a warm, steady voice. When your mother passed away, all she wanted was for you to be happy. I sold everything. I sold the family jewelry. I worked myself to exhaustion until I lost 17 kilograms. I did it all so you would never have to suffer. I kept this locket so I could give it to you when you truly became an adult. Lillian pressed the locket against her chest. A sob escaped her lips. Tears of regret fell onto the dusty floor. At that moment, all of her emotions finally broke free. She understood the depth of her father's love. She wrapped her arms tightly around me and apologized through choking sobs. I gently patted my daughter's thin back. Lillian's remorse showed me that she was beginning to awaken. She had finally seen the truth about genuine love. But the battle against the lies surrounding her husband's family had only just begun. Lillian wiped away her tears. Then something changed in her eyes. They became steady, determined, and unexpectedly sharp. She told me that she would not allow her father's sacrifices to be trampled upon. She would investigate everything and uncover the truth. A short time later, Lillian left. The gold locket was clenched tightly in her hand. She returned to the mansion, determined to dig deeper and uncover the secrets that still remained hidden. Lillian returned home with a completely different mindset. The weakness was gone. In its place was a cold determination. She waited until Richard had fallen asleep, then quietly slipped into his office. The master key she had recently found unlocked the hidden bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was the abyss of lies. Lillian began going through Richard's personal financial records page by page. The more she read, the more her hands trembled with anger. The true face of her hypocritical husband slowly emerged before her eyes. Richard's actual income was $187,000 a year. And that was not all. He also controlled a private trust fund worth millions of dollars inherited from his family. He had always had more than enough money to pay the rent and cover his daughter's tuition. Yet he had chosen to remain silent. For 8 years, he had calmly allowed his wife's retired father to shoulder every bill. Even worse, Richard had taken the money he should have been spending on housing expenses and invested it in his personal stock portfolio. He had used the sweat, sacrifice, and suffering of his father-in-law to purchase luxury watches. Some of those watches were worth more than an entire year's rent. He had been living as a parasite, draining my family in the most calculated way imaginable. Tears fell onto the financial documents. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of utter disgust. Lillian took out her phone and photographed every piece of evidence, every document, every transaction, every number. Not a single detail was missed. She realized that she had foolishly given her love to a vampire, a skilled manipulator hiding behind the image of a successful husband. Afterward, she carefully returned everything to its original place and left the office. Just as dawn began to break, my phone rang. It was Lillian. Her voice was firm and carried no trace of hesitation. "Dad, I know everything now. I'm going to make them pay for what they've done to you." I sat alone in my small apartment. The wind whistled through the cracks around the old door, and I knew that the real storm was about to descend upon that luxurious mansion. I knew this was only the beginning of what Richard and his family had been hiding from her. Just as I had predicted, the silence from Harold's family did not last long. The following morning, my phone began ringing relentlessly. Harold's number appeared on the screen. I answered. There was no greeting, no courtesy, only the rough, threatening voice of the man on the other end. Harold began speaking in an extremely arrogant tone. He said I was making a spectacle of myself. He warned me not to interfere with his family's happiness and reputation. Then he used deeply insulting words to describe my daughter. According to him, Lillian had always been nothing more than a charity case for their family. The daughter of a penniless old man, he said, should be grateful she was allowed to marry into a wealthy family. Victoria's voice suddenly joined the call. Her bitter laugh crackled through the speaker. She said that if I continued causing trouble and demanding money, they would use their influence to take custody of Emma. They would make sure Lillian walked away with nothing. They would destroy the reputation of both my daughter and me. With every insult they hurled, my chest rose and fell more heavily. My hand tightened against the edge of the old wooden table until my knuckles turned white. Their contempt for working people and their arrogance had reached a new extreme. They believed their money could buy everything. They believed my silence over the past 8 years had been weakness. But then Margaret's words echoed in my mind. The greater the storm, the calmer you must become. The person who remains calm the longest is the one who wins. I took a slow, deep breath and steadied myself. I did not become angry. I did not argue. I simply replied, in an even composed voice, "Do whatever you think you need to do." I accepted being the villain in their eyes. I accepted their insults because protecting the truth for my daughter mattered more than defending my pride. I knew Lillian needed time to prepare for the legal battle ahead. My calm response had an unexpected effect. On the other end of the line, Harold suddenly fell silent. For the first time, he sounded uneasy. Something about that quiet confidence unsettled him. He could no longer mistake my silence for surrender. I ended the call. Then I set the phone down and smiled. The storm they feared was already on its way. That evening I walked into the mansion at Lillian's request. The atmosphere felt suffocating, like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Harold, Victoria, and Richard were already seated there. Their faces carried open hostility. Richard looked at me with anger in his eyes. He thought I had come to beg. But then Lillian entered. She did not sit beside her husband. Instead, she stood next to me. Without a word, she threw a thick stack of documents onto the dining table. The sharp slap of paper against wood echoed through the room. Then she spoke. Her voice was as sharp as a blade. "Richard, explain these numbers." She pointed to the documents. $187,000 a year in income. A trust fund worth millions. Why did you lie to me? Why did you secretly profit from my father's money? You used the rent money my father paid to buy stocks and luxury watches, didn't you? Richard's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Harold slammed his hand on the table and jumped to his feet, ready to shout. Lillian immediately turned toward him. She pointed directly at her father-in-law. "And you, Harold. You're proud of your $240,000 boat, aren't you? That boat was purchased with money your son diverted while my father paid our bills. While my father survived on one meal a day, your family lived off his sacrifices. You called me a charity case. You are the parasites." Victoria was speechless. Her hands trembled as she stared at the evidence. Richard rushed forward and tried to grab Lillian's hand. She jerked away from him. When she looked at him, there was nothing left except contempt. "Let's get a divorce," she said firmly. "I may not know how to live without financial support, but I can learn how to live without lies." Richard let out a frantic laugh. "You'll leave with nothing," he snapped. "This mansion belongs to me. Only then did I calmly remove a document from my briefcase. I placed it on the table. Then I looked directly at Harold and Richard. "You're mistaken." I tapped the paper. "The purchase contract for this mansion is in my name. I paid for it in full. This property belongs to me. Beginning tomorrow, I am reclaiming my house." The room fell silent. Lillian immediately called security. She pointed toward the front door. "Remove Richard and his parents from this house, right now." Humiliated, they gathered their belongings and left that very night under the watchful eyes of the neighbors. If you've made it this far, then perhaps you're enjoying the story. Please take a quick moment to help us out, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far, and tell me what you think the final outcome of the story will be. Let's see if your prediction is right. Many people watch without doing so, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. Those despicable people deserved to pay for what they had done. Justice would be served. But that was not what I wanted most. 6 months passed in the blink of an eye. Richard's luxurious mansion had become a thing of the past. Lillian chose to close the chapter on that place entirely. She did not want to keep a single reminder of the lies that had once filled it. She and Emma moved into a small house on Elm Street. The house was 60 years old. It had a white wooden fence and a small yard filled with wild daisies. My daughter's life changed completely. There were no more expensive designer dresses, no more meaningless luxury parties. Lillian accepted a position as an assistant at a small real estate office. The work kept her busy from morning until evening. Her monthly salary was only a fraction of what she used to spend without a second thought. Yet something remarkable happened. Every time I visited, Lillian's face seemed brighter. The sadness and disappointment that once lingered in her eyes were gone. She often hummed softly while cleaning the house. The hands that once knew only manicures had learned how to cook. The little kitchen was always warm and filled with Emma's laughter. Their dinners were simple. Usually it was nothing more than beef stew cooked in the old slow cooker I had given her. But its aroma carried the feeling of a real home. It was a feeling that all the expensive scented candles in the mansion had never been able to create. Lillian had found herself again. She had regained her self-respect and independence. The contrast between honest simplicity and artificial luxury had become unmistakable. And peace had won. Watching my daughter grow stronger each day filled my heart with happiness. Margaret, wherever she was surely smiling. Lillian had not merely survived adversity, she was learning how to love life sincerely. For the first time in years, she was proud of living through the work of her own hands. One weekend evening, Lillian invited me over for dinner. After the meal, she sat down beside me. She placed a small envelope into my hand. Lillian looked at me with a serious expression. "This is something I have to do," she said. I opened the envelope. Inside was $2,700. It was the first money Lillian had earned with her own hands after months of hard work. She took hold of my calloused hand. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke. "Dad, this is the money I owe you. I know it's far too little compared to everything you sacrificed, but this is my self-respect. I want to stand on my own 2 feet." I pulled my daughter into my arms. Tears of happiness rolled down my cheeks. My Lillian had truly grown up. She had finally understood the value of honesty and freedom, and that was what I had always wanted most. Not revenge, not justice, but my daughter's peace. More importantly, I wanted to see her change, to rediscover the kindness and decency that had always been part of who she was. My family's story carries a lesson for all of us. True love is not found in luxurious marble walls or dazzling crystal chandeliers. It is found in sincere presence and honesty between people. Never build your happiness on deception or on the sacrifices of others. Consequences may arrive late, but they always arrive. Cherish the people beside you before it is too late. That night I returned to my small apartment. I placed Margaret's gold locket on the table. Then I lay down on my bed and closed my eyes. For the first time in many long years, I slept peacefully. I knew my daughter was finally safe. And finally free. Join our community by liking and subscribing for more authentic, hard-hitting family stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. Don't talk to him. He's just our butler. The words slipped lightly from Jessica's mouth, but they cut through the warm Thanksgiving dinner like a knife. I froze in place, the tray of red wine trembling slightly in my hands. 35 guests, wealthy neighbors, and my son's business partners fell silent all at once. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were an unwanted stain on their expensive carpet. I glanced at Marcus, my only son. He avoided my eyes, slowly rotating the crystal glass in his hand. Instead of standing up for the father who raised him, he stepped closer, leaned toward my ear, and whispered in a cowardly tone, "Dad, please don't embarrass us. Just go along with it, okay?" The blood in my veins seemed to freeze. In this house, I was no longer a father, no longer a grandfather, and certainly no longer a person. I was just an old piece of furniture, a ghost lurking in the corner of the room there, only to serve the illusion of their glamorous life. I suddenly laughed out loud because the man who was paying their mortgage and their credit cards was about to teach them a very expensive lesson. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a snack, sit back, and remember, the people in these stories always had every chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. You're going to like it here. My name is James. I'm 65 years old. 10 years ago, after my wife passed away, I sold my chain of auto repair shops and gathered everything I owned so I could move in with my son. Marcus and Jessica kept saying they wanted to take care of me in my old age. They painted a picture of a happy 3-generation family living together in a spacious mansion worth $1,200,000. But the reality was a painful slap in the face. What they didn't know, or chose to forget, was that I was the one who signed the check to buy this house. They didn't know that the balance in my bank account was still growing every day, with nearly $4 million from smart investments. They saw me in the gray butler's uniform that Jessica forced me to wear, and they assumed I had nothing but dependents. Jessica was an ambitious and vicious woman. She had established a kind of military regime inside the house, where I was pushed down to live in the damp basement next to the laundry room. Every morning I had to wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast, polish the floors, and do all the chores a professional housekeeper would demand a high salary for. But to them I was free labor. At today's party, the humiliation reached its peak. I watched Jessica laughing with her upper-class friends, proudly showing off a new handbag she had bought, using the supplementary credit card connected to my account, while introducing me as some lowly stranger. Every time I tried to speak with my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, Jessica would quickly step in. She didn't want me contaminating the perfect world she had created for them. The pain didn't come from being humiliated in front of strangers. It came from Marcus's silence. My son, the child I once stayed up all night caring for when he was sick, was now looking at his father like a burden that needed to be hidden. He enjoyed the luxury funded by my money, yet felt ashamed of my presence. I turned and walked into the kitchen, placing the wine tray on the marble counter. The shame I had felt moments earlier slowly faded, replaced by a chilling calm. When your self-respect has been stripped away completely, there is nothing left to fear. I glanced at the large mirror hanging in the hallway and straightened the collar of my butler's uniform. They thought I was a senile old man, someone with nowhere to go, clinging to their mercy. They were wrong. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through the bank notification that had just arrived. Total assets, $3,782,000. Enough money to buy 10 houses like this one and wipe the arrogance off Jessica's face in a single move. This little game of pretending to be their butler had gone on long enough, and I was starting to grow tired of the role. They believed they held my life in the palm of their hands, but in reality I was the one holding their financial oxygen. One click, that was all it would take, and all that glittering luxury outside would collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. Chapter 2 will expose the rot inside this $1,000,000 house. It will focus on the sharp contrast between the glamorous surface and the cruelty hidden in the basement, where James is treated like an invisible man while pushing the audience's anger to its peak as the Sunset Manor scheme begins to emerge. The party ended when the clock struck midnight. The last guests left with satisfied smiles, offering Jessica their compliments for a perfect evening and for having such a devoted butler. The moment the front door slammed shut, the smile on Jessica's face vanished, instantly replaced by the cold expression I knew so well. She tossed a dirty napkin at me and snapped that I should clean up the mess in the living room before I was allowed to go to bed. I worked in silence, At 65, my joints were no longer as flexible as they used to be, but I still bent down to pick up every crumb of cookie and wiped every streak of red wine from the hardwood floor. The master bedroom upstairs once belonged to me, the place where my wife and I had dreamed of a peaceful old age together. Now it was the territory of Jessica and Marcus. And me, I walked down the narrow, steep, dim staircase that led to the basement. My room was next to the furnace and the washing machine. It was so small it barely held a single bed and an old wardrobe. There was no window, no fresh air, only the constant rumble of the washing machine through the night and the damp smell of the earth. Jessica called it a space-saving solution, but I knew the truth. She simply wanted to push me out of sight so I wouldn't ruin the elegant image of the house. The next morning I woke up to Jessica pounding on my door. She stood there with her hands on her hips, ordering me to take Emma and Jake to school because her car was in the shop. As I held my grandchildren's hands and walked them to the car, I leaned in about to hug them the way I always did. But Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, suddenly stepped back. She looked at me with frightened eyes and said quietly, "Mom said we're not allowed to stay too close to you. She said you're a scary servant, and that your brain is broken." A child's words can cut deeper than any knife. Jessica hadn't just turned me into a servant, she was poisoning my grandchildren's minds, turning me into a monster in the eyes of the people I loved most. She was planting the idea that I was a confused old man, someone whose mind was failing so they would never respect me. It was the most refined cruelty a person could commit, stealing a grandfather's place in his grandchildren's hearts. They thought I was an old piece of furniture that needed to be thrown away. What they didn't know was that I held the combination to the very safe they had been dreaming about their entire lives. That afternoon, while I was cleaning the hallway on the second floor, I accidentally overheard a heated argument coming from Marcus's office. I was about to walk away, but the name Sunset Manor slipping from Jessica's mouth made me stop. I hid behind the thick wooden door and held my breath as I listened. "You have to sign this application," Marcus Jessica hissed through clenched teeth. "We can't keep him here forever. He's starting to lose his mind. Yesterday he even broke the Ming vase in the living room. Do you know how much that vase was worth?" Marcus hesitated. "But that's my dad. He paid for this house, Jessica. We can't just shove him into a nursing home when he's still perfectly healthy." "That's our money now," Marcus Jessica snapped coldly. "Just look at it, the joint account is running dry. If we send him to Sunset Manor, we can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, all of his investment portfolios and savings accounts will belong to us legally. I've already done the research. Sunset Manor is a very discreet place. They have their ways of making sure old men like him never walk out and cause trouble again." My chest tightened as I heard the long silence from my son. That silence hurt more than any insult. Marcus was thinking. He was weighing my entire life's fortune against his duty as a son. Then he sighed a sigh of surrender. "All right. But we have to do it carefully. We'll need a doctor to confirm early-stage dementia." Her words cut through the air like a blade. They were planning to use the very money I had spent my entire life building, to lock me away in a prison for the elderly, a place where I would be forgotten until the day I died. To them, I wasn't a father who deserved care. I was a financial obstacle that needed to be removed. Jessica's shameless cruelty had reached a level that could no longer be tolerated, and Marcus's cowardice erased the last trace of affection I still had for him. I quietly walked down the stairs, my hands trembling with rage, yet my mind strangely clear. A plan was already beginning to take shape. They wanted to play games about legal competency. They wanted control over my finances. Fine. I would show them exactly where the true power of money really lies. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to Harold, my longtime lawyer and closest friend. "Harold, I need you to prepare a few documents. It's time to activate the backup plan. And remember, keep everything quiet until the very last moment." I looked out through the small basement window where the only thing visible was the feet of people walking back and forth along the sidewalk. I had lived in the shadows for too long, endured too much, hoping that one day my son would wake up and realize what he was doing. But today that hope died. I was no longer a forgiving father. I was a millionaire protecting what belonged to me. Would Marcus choose his wife, or the father who raised him? The answer will shock you with the cruelty of people blinded by greed. Follow my story until the end, and leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the narrow single bed listening to the washing machine rumble and the laughter of Marcus and Jessica upstairs. They were opening an expensive bottle of champagne, probably celebrating the fact that their Sunset Manor plan was about to become reality. What they didn't realize was that every sip they drank tonight would become a bitter debt they would pay for the rest of their lives. My quiet revenge had officially begun, and the first card I was about to play would be the one that would make them drop to their knees in shock. They thought they were cornering me. In truth, they were only building the walls of their own prison. This game was no longer about humiliation. It was about justice. And the justice of a man who has nothing left to lose is the most terrifying kind of justice there is. Chapter 3 will mark James's transformation from a man who endured everything into a calm, calculating hunter. We will focus on the sharp contrast between James's quiet composure in his lawyer's office and the almost ridiculous chaos that erupts when Jessica suddenly finds that her lifeline has been cut off. On Monday morning, I didn't wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast like usual. Instead, I put on the most expensive custom-tailored suit I owned one. I had carefully hidden in a suitcase under my bed for the past 3 years. When I stepped into the living room, Jessica was standing there in her silk pajamas, her face still sleepy and irritated. She was about to yell, demanding to know why breakfast wasn't ready, but the words caught in her throat the moment she saw me. I was no longer the sluggish old butler. I stood straight, shoulders squared, my eyes cold like a general before battle. Without saying a word, I walked straight toward the door. "Dad, where are you going?" Marcus called after me, his voice confused. "What are you trying to do? Start a rebellion?" I simply gave a faint smile, the kind of smile he would soon learn was the warning sign of a financial catastrophe. I drove my old car to Harold's office building downtown. When I stepped into the room filled with the rich scent of oak wood and leather-bound documents, Harold greeted me with a firm handshake. "James," he said, studying my face, "I've been waiting for this call from you for 3 years. You've been far too patient." "Let's begin, Harold," I replied calmly. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every piece of legal documentation. Legally speaking, the house Marcus and Jessica were living in was entirely in my name. The $8,000 monthly allowance they received was actually an automatic transfer from my trust fund, the platinum credit card Jessica used for her extravagant shopping. It was simply an authorized card under my account. First, I said, cut off the supply line. I instructed Harold to notify the bank to immediately stop all automatic transfers into Marcus's account. Next, cancel every authorized credit card. And finally send them an official notice terminating their right to occupy the property. They would have 30 days to move out, unless they could pay market rent. $4,500 a month. Harold looked at me with quiet admiration. "So you're going all in?" "They think I'm a stray dog they took in," I said calmly. "What they don't realize is that I'm the one holding the winning hand." While I sat there, sipping black coffee with Harold, the storm was already beginning to hit the $1,000,000 house. I could almost picture it. Jessica standing at the counter of a luxury fashion boutique holding designer dresses worth thousands of dollars. She would hand over her card with that familiar smug expression, and then the cashier would look at the screen and shake her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined." Her shamelessness was astonishing. Even when cornered, she still tried to strike back with the old dementia card. But what she didn't know was that every word she said from this point on was being recorded by the pen clipped to my shirt pocket. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it would really help if you hit like and subscribe. 97% of people never do. But that's what keeps this entire channel going. I smiled a cold, chilling smile. "Don't worry about my mind, Jessica. Worry about how you're going to pay $4,500 in rent next month. Either you start looking for a smaller apartment, or you'll be out on the street." I turned and headed toward the staircase leading down to the basement. But halfway there I stopped and added, "Oh, and one more thing. Starting today I won't be making breakfast anymore. You'd better learn how to use the stove, if you can still afford the gas bill." That night, instead of the sound of the washing machine, I heard a violent argument erupting from the master bedroom. Jessica was blaming Marcus for failing to control his father, while Marcus was desperately trying to figure out how to keep their finances afloat. They were tearing into each other like animals trapped inside a glass cage. I lay on my narrow single bed and felt a strange sense of peace. This was only phase 1. They thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen. What they didn't realize was that the truth about my $4 million fortune would be the thing that would truly destroy them. Tomorrow, the family meeting I had been waiting for would finally take place. It would be the day every mask was torn away, and the parasites would be forced to face the brutal reality they had created for themselves. Would Marcus fall to his knees and beg his father for forgiveness? Or would Jessica play her final card and try one last time to send James to a nursing home? The ultimate confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 4 is the moment of judgment. I will focus on the planned stair-step reveal technique, turning the living room into a courtroom where James stands as the supreme judge. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the house was thick with hostility. Jessica and Marcus no longer had their usual polished appearance. They sat at the dining table with dark circles under their eyes and stacks of unpaid bills piled in front of them. When I walked in, Jessica didn't scream this time. She looked at me the way a snake looks just before it strikes. She pushed a sheet of paper across the table toward me. It was a psychiatric evaluation request stamped by a private clinic, a place I was certain she had bribed with the last bit of money she had left. "You've gone too far, James," Jessica said, her voice trembling with anger, though she tried to sound triumphant. "We've already contacted Sunset Manor. They'll be here tomorrow morning to take you for treatment. If you're smart, you'll give us $5,000 right now to pay off these debts, and maybe I'll consider arranging a nicer room for you there." Marcus stared down at the floor and muttered weakly, "Dad, this is for your own good. You're losing control, and we need to protect the family's assets." I didn't respond. Instead, I slowly placed a black leather briefcase on the table. I opened the lock and the sharp click echoed through the silent room like the sound of a gun being cocked. I pulled out the first document. They thought I was a stray dog they had taken in, but they had no idea I was the one holding the winning hand. "This," I said, placing the paper on the table, "is the certificate of land use rights and home ownership. You say you want to protect the family's assets. Then take a good look at who the sole owner of this $1.2 million house really is. Not Marcus. Not Jessica. Me, James Pierce. And this morning I filed an eviction request with the court." Jessica's face drained of color. She grabbed the document with trembling hands, her expression shifting from pale to ghost white. Marcus's mouth fell open. But when we bought the house, you said it was a gift to us," he stammered. "A gift of use, not ownership," I replied coldly. "And that privilege ended the moment you turned your father into a basement butler." "But that's not all." I pulled out the second document. "These are detailed statements from 3 different banks. My current total balance is $3,782,000. For the past 3 years, I've spent more than $300,000 just to maintain your ridiculous, extravagant lifestyle. I'm not some confused old man who needs financial protection. I'm the man who has been feeding this rotten family while the two of you played dress-up as high society." Silence filled the room. Jessica stared at the unbelievable numbers on the bank statement. The greed in her eyes suddenly transformed into a nauseating display of fake remorse. She tried to reach out and touch my hand, but I pulled away. Dad, Marcus stammered, his voice breaking. "We didn't know. We're truly sorry. We'll make it right. We'll move you back to the master bedroom immediately." I looked at my son and felt something deeper than anger. Pity. "You're not sorry because you mistreated me," I said calmly. "You're sorry because you accidentally mistreated a millionaire." And now I continued, "Here's the final card." I placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. Jessica's cold voice filled the room. "We can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, his entire investment portfolio will belong to us. Sunset Manor will make sure he never walks out and causes trouble again." Jessica collapsed into her chair, the color draining from her face. Marcus looked at his wife as if he were seeing a stranger, but I knew he was just as guilty through his silence. "You were planning to use my own money to lock me in a nursing home?" I asked. Every word landed like a stone on their chests. "You think my mind is broken? No, my mind is perfectly clear. Clear enough to record this betrayal. I've already sent that recording along with evidence of elder abuse to my lawyer and the police. If you've listened this far, do us one small favor. It only takes a second. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it means a lot to this channel." Jessica suddenly jumped to her feet, screaming like someone losing her mind. "You can't do this. You're his father. You can't throw us out onto the street." I stood up and calmly gathered my papers. There was no warmth left in my eyes for this woman. I'm not throwing you onto the street, I said quietly. I'm simply giving you the freedom you've always wanted. Freedom from my support. Freedom to earn your own living. I looked at Marcus one last time. Your car will be repossessed this afternoon. Your credit cards are dead. And by the end of the weekend, the locks on this house will be changed. You have 48 hours to pack your things. Then I turned and walked up the stairs, not down to the basement, but straight into the master bedroom. For the first time in 3 years, I walked like the true owner of this house. Downstairs, the shouting and crying erupted again. But this time it didn't bother me. The game was over, the masks had fallen, and justice, late though it was, had been delivered with the cold precision of numbers. What do you think about the way James turned the tables? Will Jessica accept defeat? Or is she planning one last move during those final 48 hours? The truth revealed in the final chapter may make you rethink the true value of family. This final chapter will be a cleansing of James's soul and a fitting sentence for the greedy. We will end this journey with a feeling of peace, powerful and well-earned. 48 hours passed like a quiet purge. The mansion that once echoed with the fake laughter of upscale parties was now filled only with the sound of packing tape sealing cardboard boxes and the tired echoes of arguments. Jessica, the woman who once treated me like a ghost in the basement, chose the most cowardly path. Instead of kneeling down to apologize and ask for mercy, she packed up the last of her designer belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind a divorce paper for Marcus. Greed had been the only glue keeping her there, and when the money stopped flowing, she vanished like smoke. Marcus stood in the empty living room watching the taxi that carried his wife away. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. Without credit cards, without protection, he was just a middle-aged man with no real survival skills. I walked down the stairs this time wearing a simple but neatly pressed shirt. I didn't look at him with anger, but with a strange calmness. Marcus looked up, his voice hoarse. "Dad, I've lost everything. She's gone. What am I supposed to do now?" I poured a glass of water and placed it on the oak table that I had paid for with my own hands. "You haven't lost everything, Marcus," I said quietly. "You still have your hands, and you still have a name that hasn't been written in the black book of the law. I won't throw you out onto the street immediately, but you will live in the basement." Marcus stared at me in shock. I continued firmly. "You'll stay in the room next to the washing machine. You'll get a job, any job, and you'll pay me $2,000 in rent every month. If you're late, even one day, the door will be locked. If you complain once, you're out. This is the only way you'll find the identity of the man you lost during those years of blind indulgence." For the first time in many years, I saw Marcus cry. Not the fake tears of manipulation, but the tears of a child who had finally realized how terribly wrong he had been. Without saying a word, he picked up his suitcase and walked down to the basement, the place that had once been my home. I returned to the master bedroom and opened the windows wide, letting the sunlight pour in. I took out the photograph of my wife and placed it carefully on the dresser. I had kept my promise to her. I didn't allow our son to become completely ruined, but I also refused to let myself be trampled. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more hard-earned lessons about dignity, family, and the true cost of betrayal. My story may make many people angry, but it carries a harsh truth about life. Respect is not something you can simply grant yourself, it has to be earned. And sometimes, in order to protect love, you must learn to use the firmness of money and the power of the law. To those of you who have followed this story, I want to share a few lessons from a man who has lived nearly an entire lifetime. First, kindness without boundaries only feeds the ungrateful. Never confuse compassion with weakness. The moment you allow someone to cross the line of your self-respect, you are teaching them how to trample on you. Second, money is only a tool, but the way you use it reveals your true character. Jessica and Marcus saw the numbers, but they were blind to the value of the man who created them. Never bite the hand that feeds you, because when that hand closes into a fist, the price you pay will be total collapse. Finally, family is meant to be a place of love, not exploitation. $1 million mansion can never become a home if it is built on lies and cruelty. I looked down at the garden where Emma and Jake were playing together. I had reclaimed my right to be their grandfather. I will teach them the value of hard work, the importance of gratitude, and the truth that respect is not something you can simply claim, it must be earned. My name is James, and this is the story of my justified revenge on Dad's real-life revenge. Thank you for listening and staying with me until this final moment. Remember this in life. You can choose to be anyone, but choose to be a person of character. I'll see you again in the next stories. Just one seat at the graduation ceremony showed me exactly where I stood in my own family. It began with a phone call I was never supposed to overhear, and ended with a silence so heavy it crushed everything inside me. For 17 years, I had never missed a single milestone in Jasmine's life. Today was her graduation day at Howard University. I woke up at 5 in the morning. I carefully ironed my best shirt. I slowly tied the necktie Jasmine had given me for my birthday 3 years ago. I was proud. I was happy. I truly believed I was the luckiest father in the world. But my world collapsed, right there in the entrance hall. Diane walked toward me with a cold expression on her face. She would not even look me in the eyes. She handed me a small piece of paper and whispered in a quiet but merciless voice, "You should sit in the backup seats at the back. The front row belongs to Marcus. Jasmine needs graduation photos with her real father. Having you there would ruin the perfect family picture." Her words stabbed straight into my chest. I stood frozen among the crowd. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. Seat 15. The very last row. The place reserved for unwanted guests. The place hidden behind the bright stage lights. Up front, Jasmine was smiling brightly in her graduation gown. She threw her arms around Marcus, the man who had not paid a single dollar in child support for 17 years. The man who only showed up after all the hard work was already done. "Dad, I did it," Jasmine shouted happily. And she was not talking to me. I stood there, holding a bouquet of deep red roses. I had handpicked every single flower for my daughter. Without realizing it, I squeezed the stems tighter and tighter. Sharp thorns pierced deep into my skin. Warm blood trickled down, slowly, soaking through the silver wrapping paper. But that physical pain meant nothing compared to the humiliation tearing through my soul. Had I really spent my entire life raising a child with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice, only to be treated like a stranger in the end? Welcome to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. You are going to love it here. Betrayal does not always come like a slap across the face. Sometimes it comes when the people you love ask you to step aside so someone else can enjoy the rewards of your sacrifice. I turned around and walked away. I left behind their fake laughter and hollow happiness. The thunderous applause echoing through the halls of Howard University sounded unbearable to my ears. I sat alone on an ice-cold stone bench outside the campus. The blood on my palms had already dried into dark stains. Memories from the last 17 years came flooding back like a slow-moving film, crushing my chest with every passing second. Jasmine was 7 years old that year. She came home sobbing because other children mocked her crooked teeth. Seeing my little girl cry tore me apart inside. Diane looked at me and sighed. Braces at that time cost more money than we could possibly afford. But I promised my daughter I would give her the best life I could. And I kept that promise. That was when my endless nights at the frozen warehouse began. My shift started at 10 at night and ended at 6 the next morning. I carried heavy boxes weighing dozens of pounds inside temperatures below freezing. My body trembled constantly. My fingers ached every time the weather changed. My back hurt so badly there were mornings when I could barely stand upright. But every month when I saw the savings growing little by little, I smiled. My love for this family was never built on sweet words. It was written in cold numbers on bank statements. Numbers bought with my sweat and blood. I denied myself everything so Diane and Jasmine could live comfortably and never feel inferior to anyone else. I believed my sacrifices were building a strong and loving home. But I was wrong. I was building a magnificent castle on sand. And sand always washes away. Today's betrayal was not sudden. It had been growing quietly for 17 years, fed by my own silence and tolerance. They had become so used to receiving my sacrifices that they no longer saw them as sacrifices at all. To them, my pain had become normal, expected. If you have ever felt taken for granted after giving someone everything, you had hit the like button. I slowly stood up. Then I threw the blood-stained bouquet of roses into a trash can beside the road. My patience had finally reached its limit. Did they really think I would continue sacrificing myself quietly in the shadows forever? No. My plan to reclaim justice began at that exact moment. The train of their perfect lives was about to crash downhill, the second the silent driver me finally let go of the wheel. I drove back to our house. My mind was completely numb, but my chest burned with rage. For 17 years I had lived inside a world built on cruel contradictions. I finally realized that I had only ever been the silent worker behind the curtain while someone else played the hero making empty promises. When Jasmine was 14, she dreamed of joining the city's professional ballet academy. The tuition for that prestigious arts program was outrageously expensive. Marcus showed up one evening carrying a bright red rose. He smiled confidently and promised Jasmine he would pay every cent of her tuition. Jasmine nearly exploded with happiness. She threw her arms around him, took pictures together, and posted them all over social media. Thousands of people liked the photo beneath the caption, "The best dad in the world." But 3 days later, the tuition bill arrived at our house. Marcus blocked Diane's phone number. Then he disappeared, without a trace. I was the one who quietly pushed my only motorcycle to a pawn shop and sold it to pay for Jasmine's classes. For an entire year, I walked to work through rain, snow, and freezing winds because I no longer had a vehicle. Jasmine never knew the truth. She still believed the money came from Marcus. And I stayed silent because I did not want to destroy the image of her biological father in her heart. My sacrifices had slowly turned me into air inside that house. And air is invisible. Nobody notices air until they start suffocating. Diane and Jasmine were always dazzled by Marcus's flashy promises and fake charm. They treated my sweat, exhaustion, and money as something ordinary, something expected. When Marcus bought a cheap bracelet, they treasured it like priceless gold. When I provided an entire stable life, they treated it as nothing more than the duty of a servant. This injustice had to end. Marcus's fake brilliance and their endless ingratitude had pushed me to the edge. They had no idea that the true face behind all those promises was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible. And this was only the beginning. The breaking point came when Jasmine received her acceptance letter to Howard University. The tuition was an enormous burden. And just like every other time, Marcus appeared right on cue. He promised he would take care of everything. But 1 week before enrollment, he suddenly vanished again. He sent a short message claiming his investments had failed and that he was bankrupt. Jasmine cried until her eyes were swollen. Diane nearly lost her mind with panic. And once again I stepped in to carry the weight they could not bear. I made the decision to withdraw every dollar from the retirement fund I had spent half my life building. That money was supposed to protect me in old age. My hands trembled as I signed the withdrawal papers, but my heart felt strangely calm. I believed this sacrifice would finally prove the depth of my unconditional love. I believed they would finally understand who had truly stood beside them whenever storms came crashing down. I was wrong. That retirement fund bought me nothing except a betrayal so cruel it had been planned long before I ever discovered it. 1 week before the graduation ceremony, I came home earlier than usual because of severe back pain. The house was quiet. Then I heard whispers coming from the master bedroom. It was Diane. She was speaking to Marcus on the phone. I froze in the hallway outside the door. Diane lowered her voice and said softly, "Don't worry. Everything is going exactly as planned. Once Jasmine graduates, we can finally push that troublesome old man out of the family picture. Without his money, Jasmine never would have finished college anyway. But now she has a good job in the city. He's no longer useful to us." My entire body went numb. Then Diane continued, "We'll move into the new apartment Jasmine rented. You'll finally get to stand beside your daughter as the official father at all the high-class parties. And don't worry about this house. I'll force him to sign it over to me." Every word poured into my soul like freezing water. My ears rang. My heart stopped beating. The woman I had loved and protected for 17 years saw me as nothing more than a machine for money. They had waited for me to bleed myself dry so they could throw me away like a worthless rag the moment they no longer needed me. Do not scream so people can see your pain. Stand up and walk away the moment the graduation ceremony of exploitation begins. Hit like if you agree. That was the moment my patience finally died. The fragile contract called family had already been torn apart by their own hands. I did not cry. I smiled coldly in the darkness. They wanted to erase me from their perfect picture. Fine. But before I stepped out of that picture, I was going to burn the entire canvas to the ground. That night I began preparing a graduation gift that Diane, Jasmine, and Marcus would remember for the rest of their lives. I walked out of the halls of Howard University in complete silence. I did not wait for the graduation ceremony to end. I did not look back at their glowing smiles even once. That night I sat alone in my office. The room was completely dark. The pain inside me had disappeared. All that remained was a terrifying level of clarity. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls before dawn. The first call was to the property management company. I was the sole leaseholder for the luxury apartment Jasmine had rented downtown. In a cold and steady voice, I requested the immediate termination of the lease agreement. I agreed to forfeit the security deposit. The apartment would be reclaimed by the end of the month. Jasmine would no longer have a beautiful place to move into with her wonderful biological father. The second call was to the bank. I ordered every supplementary credit card belonging to Diane and Jasmine to be frozen immediately. For 17 years, they had used my money for designer clothes, luxury dinners, and glamorous lifestyles. As of tonight, that river of money had officially dried up. I was no longer the devoted husband. I was now a man, enforcing ownership over what belonged to him. The final call was to a real estate agency. The house we lived in had always belonged entirely to me long before the marriage. I instructed the agent to sell it immediately for 10% below market value. My only condition was speed. I wanted every legal procedure completed within 2 weeks. They thought I was just a foolish man who worked himself to death without asking questions. They believed they could drain every drop of my finances and casually throw me away afterward. They were wrong. I was the one who built their fake paradise with my own hands, and I could destroy it just as easily. This war had only begun, and they were still celebrating their victory, without realizing the ground beneath them was already collapsing. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises, Diane and Jasmine will receive their first brutal slap from reality. Are you curious to see how they react when they realize the gold mine they despised has officially closed forever? Stay tuned for the next chapter to witness the full force of this reckoning. The next morning, Diane and Jasmine returned home just after sunrise. I was sitting calmly in the living room reading the newspaper and sipping a cup of bitter coffee. They walked inside, looking exhausted, but their smiles still filled the room. The moment Diane saw me, she started complaining. She grumbled that Marcus had once again forgotten his wallet during their celebration dinner at a 5-star restaurant the night before. Jasmine immediately defended her biological father. A great man like Marcus should not have to worry about petty money problems, she said proudly. I did not say a single word. I simply smiled. Their awakening began less than an hour later. On her way to work, Diane stopped at her usual Starbucks for one of her expensive coffees. Casually, she swiped the supplementary credit card I had given her years ago. Beep. The payment machine rejected it. The cashier gave her an awkward smile. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined. Diane frowned in irritation and tried again. Declined. Again. This time, panic flashed across her face. Seconds later, my phone rang. The moment I answered, Diane exploded with fury. Lucas, what did you do to my account? Unlock the card. Right now I'm standing here humiliating myself in this coffee shop. My voice remained perfectly calm. There's nothing wrong with the card. I canceled it. Starting today, you can pay for your perfect little life yourselves. Then I hung up before she could scream another word. At the exact same time, Jasmine received an urgent email from the property management company. The message informed her that the lease for her luxury apartment had been terminated immediately. She was required to remove all her belongings before the 31st of the month. That was when real panic finally began spreading through both of them. For the first time in years, they realized the invisible support system surrounding their lives was disappearing piece by piece. The glamorous mask they wore so proudly was slowly being ripped away layer after layer. But this was only a light appetizer before the real punishment began. Tonight's confrontation at the dinner table would expose every ugly truth completely. Did they really believe they could corner me so easily? Then they should prepare themselves for the final audit from the man they once called the troublesome old burden. That night, the family dinner table turned into a cold execution chamber. Diane and Jasmine stormed into the house with fury burning across their faces. They slammed their hands onto the table and shouted directly at me. Have you lost your mind, Lucas? How dare you freeze our cards and cancel Jasmine's apartment? Do you have any idea how humiliated we were today? I did not flinch. Slowly, I pushed a thick stack of documents across the table toward them. It was the most detailed financial audit they had ever seen in their lives. I looked directly at Jasmine. My voice was as cold as ice. For 17 years, this is the exact amount I spent on both of you. $1,240,000. Your braces. Your ballet academy tuition. Your expensive education at Howard University. Every single dollar came from my sweat and blood. I leaned forward slightly. Marcus made promises. I was the one who carried them out. I was the one who emptied his retirement fund so you could hold your head high beside your wealthy classmates. And yet at your graduation yesterday, both of you pushed me to seat 15 in the back row so a man who contributed nothing could stand in the spotlight. Diane let out a mocking laugh. So now you're counting every penny you spent on your wife and daughter. That's pathetic. This house belongs to me too. You can't treat us like this. Without changing my expression, I pulled out one final document. The property ownership papers. And the completed sale agreement. I looked directly into Diane's eyes. This house was entirely mine before we got married. And I already sold it. You have exactly 2 weeks to remove every belonging you own. The new owner takes possession on the 15th. Jasmine suddenly burst into tears. She stared at me with shock, fear, and desperation in her eyes. Dad, are you throwing me away? Are you still my father? Slowly, I stood up. I looked at the daughter I had once loved more than my own life. Then I answered in a low but unshakable voice. I'm not throwing you away, Jasmine. I'm simply returning you to the place you chose for yourself. The front row beside your biological father. The room went silent. You already planned to erase me from your family picture after graduation. I'm only helping you do it a little sooner. Diane and Jasmine stood frozen in place. Their faces turned pale. Not a trace of color remained. The brutal truth had completely shattered the fantasy they had been living in. But the punishment was still far from over, because the real question had not been answered yet. What would happen when their beloved hero Marcus finally had to face? Diane completely lost control. She screamed hysterically and tore the audit papers into pieces, scattering them across the table like falling ashes. Then she unleashed the cruelest insults she could think of. You're a controlling monster, Lucas. You want to destroy your own daughter's future over a single seat. You're selfish. I watched the shredded papers drift through the air. Inside me, there was nothing left to shake. Diane's rage only proved one thing. They were terrified. Terrified of reality finally arriving at their doorstep. Without saying another word, I walked into my room and returned with the suitcase I had already packed. My voice was calm, cold, and final. You have exactly 2 weeks to leave this illusion behind. Move out willingly or be forced out. Your choice. This house no longer has anything to do with me. Then I walked toward the front door. I did not look back at Jasmine's late tears or Diane's violent outburst echoing behind me. The night air in Annapolis was cold and fierce. I walked slowly down the familiar street leading toward the main road. And there, beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, I saw Marcus's polished luxury car parked at the corner. Marcus leaned casually against it, scrolling through his phone with a smug smile on his face. Maybe he was waiting for Diane to bring him the good news about the house transfer. Or maybe he was fantasizing about his glamorous future, beside a Howard University graduate daughter he had never spent a single dollar raising. This time I walked directly toward him first. The moment Marcus saw the suitcase in my hand, he straightened up nervously. I looked directly into the calculating eyes of the man who had betrayed me for 17 years. Then I smiled. The bill for your perfect family is finally coming due, Marcus. His expression instantly changed. The house is sold. The bank accounts are frozen. Jasmine's apartment is gone too. So starting tomorrow, you'll be the one paying for their glamorous lifestyle. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase and stepped closer. Good luck. Marcus's confident expression collapsed into pure shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I turned around and walked away without waiting for a response. The game of switched roles was finally complete. Now the man who made promises would have to carry the full weight of 2 ungrateful people with empty pockets. And without my money holding everything together, the true nature of their parasitic relationship would finally be exposed. The next 6 months would become a living hell that stripped every layer of fake love away one by one. How long do you think Marcus will stay loyal once the gold mine disappears forever? 6 months passed quickly. I moved to Annapolis and settled into a quiet little coastal town. I bought an old woodworking shop and started over from scratch. There were no more complaints from Diane. No more crushing financial pressure. My hands were now covered with sawdust paint stains and rough calluses from carving wood instead of bleeding from rose thorns. For the first time in many years, my soul finally found peace. Late one evening, my phone vibrated softly. A text message appeared from an unfamiliar number, but I immediately knew who it was. Jasmine. She sent me a screenshot of a bank transfer. $500. Below it was a short message. Dad, this is my first paycheck. I'm sending you a small part of it to repay what I owe you. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you stay healthy. I stared silently at the screen for a long time. Surprisingly, I felt no hatred, no triumph either, only a strange sense of calm. For the first time in her life, Jasmine had begun to understand the value of hard work. She finally understood what it meant to earn money with sacrifice and exhaustion instead of taking it for granted. Through a few old acquaintances, I eventually learned what happened after I left. The truth revealed itself almost immediately. Just as I predicted, Marcus abandoned Diane within the very first week, after discovering she no longer had a house savings or financial security. He disappeared as quickly as he had once appeared. Marcus never wanted responsibility. He only loved comfort funded by someone else. Diane and Jasmine were forced to rent a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in years, they had to face rent payments, utility bills, groceries, and financial stress completely on their own. But the greatest punishment was never poverty. The greatest punishment was forcing them to face reality without my silent protection standing behind them. Only after the glamorous curtain finally fell did they realize the man they looked down on had been the very person keeping them from collapsing into the abyss. Every debt of loyalty and betrayal had finally been settled. But my story does not end with revenge. Because inside this small woodworking shop lies the most important lesson I want to leave behind for all of you. Stay with me for the final reflections, because if you are also living through injustice, abandonment, or silent sacrifice, you may discover the path that finally sets you free. The soft scent of pine wood drifted through my small woodworking shop in Annapolis. The golden evening sunlight stretched across the handcrafted benches I had built with my own hands. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and quietly admired my work. After 17 long years, my journey had finally ended in a silence filled with dignity. I may have lost a fake family, but I finally found myself again. Standing inside this workshop, I learned 3 painful lessons about life. The first lesson is about self-worth. Never measure your value based on the approval of ungrateful people. The second lesson is about respect. Love without respect is nothing more than a cruel form of emotional parasitism. And the final lesson is about kindness. Never allow your kindness to become an unlimited free service. The more easily you sacrifice yourself, the more people begin to treat your pain as your obligation. I looked at the simple wooden chair I had just finished building. It stood firm and strong. It was not sitting in seat 15 behind anyone else's spotlight. It belonged on a stage built by my own hands. If people refuse to give you the seat you deserve, then build your own stage. Do not beg for pity. Do not tolerate humiliation just to preserve the illusion of a happy family. My story is a warning to everyone, silently sacrificing themselves in the dark. Your silence does not make selfish people grateful. It only feeds their greed. Be brave enough to walk away once your limits have been crossed. Join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing for more real, emotional, and hard-hitting family stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I turned off the lights and closed the door to the workshop behind me. The streets of Annapolis were glowing beneath the night sky. And for the first time in many years, I walked forward feeling completely free. My real life was only beginning now.